Welcome back to another video discussing some of the most underappreciated Pokemon in the series. Today, we're going to talk about the top 10 most underrated Pokemon in the original Gen 1 games, Red, Blue, and Yellow. Now, I've also done some videos discussing the top 10 strongest Pokemon available in each generation, but those were very heavily focused on high-level competitive play statistics and the overall meta. For this video, while competitive isn't completely ignored, I'm definitely going to be thinking about in-game playthrough elements a lot more here, as well as designs and how much attention they get, like with most recent videos discussing underrated Pokemon. Also, as far as gameplay goes, this will most likely be for how they are in the actual Gen 1 games, and not so much how underrated these Kanto Pokemon might be in, say, Gen 5. Before we start though, you guys know the usual routine: reads and shorts. But with that out of the way, let's just get right into the list you clicked on this video for. I feel like our pick to start things off is appropriately a little humble, and that's Raticate. Raticate is a pretty interesting Pokemon in Gen 1, almost entirely because of Super Fang, which removes half of the target's current health. This has a really interesting use in several aspects of the game. If you're insane enough to try it in overused Gen 1 competitive, then it's actually not bad as a niche against very tanky Pokemon like Snorlax and Chansey. But, I mean, you're still not using Raticate in that scenario over Tauros. It also has a decent 81 attack and base 97 speed. For the first early game normal type, those are pretty effective stats. It also only evolves at level 20, which makes it pretty decent for playthroughs as well. But obviously there's a reason it's all the way up at number 10. It's a good beginner Pokemon in a generation where normal types are above most other types, due to having a more fleshed out option of move pools than the others. And for that reason, I think Raticate deserves a little more respect than it gets. Now we're going to go in the opposite direction, because number 9 is Jinx. Now, Jinx is actually awesome in Gen 1. The reason why she's here is because not enough people talk about just how excellent she is. For example, yeah, she's a Psychic type, and that's nuts in Gen 1, but she's also an Ice type. You know how Ice is terrible defensively? Well, it's not quite as bad as in Gen 1 as it is in later gens, especially in standard competitive Gen 1, where there's almost never going to be any fire and fighting types in OU. That means it gets stabbed Psychic and Blizzard, by the way. Both very good in normal play and the competitive meta in Gen 1. Plus, Lovely Kiss with high speed is also excellent. But generally, unlike a Pokemon like, say, Starmie, some fans not familiar with both the current competitive meta and maybe even just Gen 1 in general severely underestimate just how good she is in Gen 1. The only problem is that it's very fragile with mediocre HP and horrible physical defense. But otherwise, on your next playthrough or your next time checking out the competitive meta for Red, Blue, and Yellow, I'd definitely check it out. Next, we have one that I think is underrated beyond just something like gameplay. It's hard not to be overshadowed when your previous form is the most popular and well-known Pokemon in the entire franchise. That's right, our number 8 is Raichu. Now, I'm not going to complain about Pikachu being more popular. It's basically a perfect mascot for the series all around. But Raichu design-wise alone is such a good follow-up to it, and it's unfortunate that it's put in such a difficult position. Gameplay-wise, it's also overshadowed in Red, Blue, and Yellow, but not by Pikachu. At least, not yet. While it's actually pretty good for your typical in-game playthrough, and its previous form can be obtained before even the first badge, it is very overshadowed by Jolteon if you don't want to count how early you can obtain it. And if you're talking competitive, it's massively overshadowed again by Jolteon, and even more so by Zapdos in OU. It can do great damage, and it's fast, but like the other Pokemon mentioned so far on the list, it's very frail. But even with that, I think Raichu deserves a little more respect than it gets all around in this series, even beyond just gameplay mechanics. At number 7, we have our only legendary, Articuno. If you've been watching my recent videos, then this isn't the first time in recent history I've acknowledged Articuno being underrated, so I'll keep it brief. Basically, Articuno is often considered mechanically the worst of the 3 Kanto birds, but in red, blue, and yellow, it's typically accepted to be better than Moltres, but still not nearly as efficient as Zapdos. Moltres would benefit more than Articuno later on in the series when the fire typing is less of a burden and benefits more from new mechanics. But here in Gen 1, Articuno is not as burdened by its ice type as it would be later on, though its move pool options aren't terribly interesting. You're basically just looking to hit stuff with Ice Beam and Blizzard for stab. For in-game playthroughs, all 3 legendary birds are excellent at the end of the day. There isn't any weird power creep stuff going on yet so early in the series, so just the base stats on these Pokemon alone will demand some type of respect from the player one way or another. Here we have a Pokemon that is a victim of unfortunate design choices in Gen 1, Kabutops. And of course, I mean gameplay design choices. Visually, Kabutops is a top tier looking Fossilmon. I think if it had a boring design, I don't think it'd even be at number 6. Its biggest problem is lack of Rock Stab and its mediocre special not being able to fully take advantage of Water Stab. The Rock-Water combo is interesting, but doesn't do it major favors defensively sometimes. Though being able to resist normal type attacks when normal type is so powerful in Gen 1 is still nice. While it does struggle to find a place competitively past the never used tier, it does get better in the generations that follow until the power creep just becomes too much later on. But for red, blue, and yellow, it does shine in a way that is underappreciated for in-game playthroughs. With the way speed works in Gen 1, it means that Kabutops Slash will basically always crit, meaning you're going to be torturing NPC trainers pretty quickly regardless, since its physical attack is a whopping 115. Its physical defense is also sturdy at 105, which helps with its mediocre HP. Personally, I think this one is very overlooked in Gen 1, and even in other games like Black and White, where it made its place as one of the best Pokemon in rarely used history. Plus, again, just look at it. It's absolutely one of the most badass designs in the series to this day. Next, we have a Pokemon that's definitely less flashy than Kabutops, Dodrio. The type combo of normal flying is often seen as pretty boring, but Dodrio makes it look really good here. I can just point out that being a normal type gives you strong offensive stab options. Mention the incredible 115 physical attack, 100 speed, and call it a day. It should be obvious. But even with that, it's easy to forget how that speed affects crit and how Hyper Beam works in Gen 1, where it won't force you to recharge if you KO with it. This makes it offensively excellent, and no one talks about it. No one talks about Dodrio. It's just kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, and its design doesn't stick out much, so that doesn't help either. While it is a good Pokemon, it does struggle to find a place in overuse competitive too, as there are a bunch of other strong normal types to choose from, particularly Tauros. That being said, Dodrio still should be acknowledged as by far one of the better offensive Pokemon in the original Kanto games. At number 4, we have yet another Pokemon that is genuinely pretty solid, even without the warranted label of being underrated. This time, it's Tentacruel. Even though this list is specifically about the Gen 1 games, I do need to point out that Tentacruel is one of the only non-legendary Pokemon that hasn't massively fallen throughout the years in competitive, despite all the power creep and changes to mechanics over the years. It's never fallen to the NU tier. It's always had a place above it somewhere. But ignoring that, there's not much to not like about Tentacruel. Insane pre-special split stat? Check. Annoying rat mechanic? Check. Cool design? Definitely check. Easy to find and catch? Check. That being said, as much as I love Tentacruel, it is largely overshadowed by Starmie. And in Gen 1, being Water Psychic is leagues better than being Water Poison, competitive or not. But that aside, Tentacruel is yet another Pokemon that deserves quite a bit of respect, even long after Red, Blue, and Yellow. Our number 3 entry can be seen as sort of a spiritual follow-up to our number 5 pick, Dodrio. As some may have expected going into this list, I'm talking about Kangaskhan. Its speed and attack are almost as high as Dodrio's, but with defense and HP that are significantly higher. It's easy to forget that this big, bulky Pokemon has 90 base speed. That's deceptively fast considering its design. It can take advantage of Stab, Hyper Beam, and Body Slam like Dodrio, but it gets way more interesting coverage options like Blizzard or Rock Slide, though its special stat is at a very bad 40. Why don't you see it more in Gen 1? Well, it's a similar story to the rest. There are just more popular options like Snorlax and Tauros. Some players also may not care for the Safari Zone as a method of catching Pokemon either, though most of the best normal types in Kanto come from that place. Regardless, it's yet another strong normal type in Red, Blue, and Yellow that gets a little lost in the shuffle, but it's worth using in both your playthroughs and in the UU meta. If you followed Gen 1 competitive for the past couple of years, this Pokemon is a little bit of a meme for having a strange period of hopping in and out of the OU meta, then back to UU where it belongs. Victreebel. This is absolutely one of the best grass types, and for your in-game playthrough, it's not hard to get. Didn't pick Bulbasaur as your starter? Want a grass type? Bellsprout is an easy catch, and it's thankfully not a Pokemon that needs a trade to obtain its third form like Machamp. It runs around with its 100 special and 105 base attack stats. The latter is kind of surprising, since all grass type attacks were considered non-physical back then. But since it can learn Swords Dance, it could pair it up with Hyper Beam to make low physical defense psychic types back off that would otherwise take advantage of Victreebel's unfortunate secondary poison typing. It also has Sleep Powder and Wrap, which is pretty busted in Gen 1. It can carry you through basically the entire game up to the champion if you use it well enough, though it's pretty tedious after a while. Overall, it's a bit overshadowed most of the time by Executor, which is yet another Safari Zone Pokemon. And some fans may actually consider it overrated and not underrated because of its weird stint in competitive OU. But I think it's still pretty good even in the current UU meta. And more specifically, I think it's just underrated in general. It's easy to become attached to other Pokemon you can obtain earlier in the game. Its design is also just a plant that can devour anything, and that's kinda terrifying. And it's a pretty solid grass type at the end of the day. And our number 1 most underrated Pokemon is Sandslash. When I started doing some more Gen 1 related lists recently, I didn't think I'd end up having much to say about this Pokemon. I've always been kind of neutral toward it. It always kind of felt like the ground type counterpart to Raichu. It even comes right after its evolution line in the Pokedex. Now, make no mistake, Sandslash is not this super-powered secret weapon where it's going to slay in the competitive meta and redefine how you look at Red, Blue, and Yellow, but it is definitely overlooked massively in Gen 1. Yeah, it's a little better in Gen 2, but in its introductory gen, there's still quite a bit to talk about with Sandslash. First of all, you can get Sandshrew very early in game, and it evolves pretty early too at only level 22. Sandslash is seriously a monster in playthroughs from start to finish, and the fact that it evolves so early is a big selling point. Also, what is considered the best attacks for certain types today aren't in Gen 1, but for ground types, they've got that trusty Stab Earthquake already. Think about how many damn times I mention this move for like every game when talking about movesets, even casually. Having an attack with 100 power and 100% accuracy back then was a huge deal. And with Swords Dance and its own 100 base attack power, that spells disaster for you if you're not a flying type. It's also got a sturdy 110 defense that lets it go toe-to-toe with much bigger physical attackers fearlessly. Though its special stat is very poor, its immunity to electric is incredible, since Thunder Wave is so common even in NPC battles. So being immune to that, as well as powerful thunderbolts that would otherwise be crippling, is a huge deal. Unfortunately, unlike Dugtrio, Sandslash isn't very fast, so it needs to be facing the right Pokemon in order to set up well. Its 75 base HP isn't great, but it's still a little better than Raichu's. There are two other unique things about Sandslash that I think aren't talked about too often. The first is competitive, where yeah, it's not super great in any specific meta. Because of this, it's relegated to PU, but it does simultaneously fill a niche in every meta at the same time, because it counters at least a few of the top Pokemon in every tier. In the OU tier, for example, Jolteon can't really do anything about Sandslash, and Rhydon, a more common Pokemon in the tier these days, also doesn't do too well against the Swords Dance Sandslash that's been set up. You want to use it on your never used team? It eats up a ton of low defense Pokemon there, and even gives the once high esteemed Golem issues. Now, does that mean you should put it in your OU team and expect to win tournaments? Hell no. Ultimately, it's number one not because it's the best Pokemon in this list, but because arguably it's the most underrated. It's still got tons of checks from Pokemon with coverage and such, but being able to carve out a niche in every tier enough to make players not throw caution to win when seeing it with such simple moveset options doesn't happen often. And the fact it can bully certain Pokemon that are just objectively bigger and stronger is what makes it, well, underappreciated, especially when you stack that on top of the fact that it's so good in single player playthroughs. The other unique thing about Sandslash is that it tends to do better than most other Pokemon in single player when facing teams that are a higher level than you, similar to Tauros. This is kind of important since it's pretty easy to be outleveled in Gen 1 later on. In Pokemon Yellow in particular, if Blue's Eevee becomes a Jolteon, it's supposed to be one of his biggest threats. Yet, a Sandslash 23 levels lower than it will swat it away. Though Blue has his own Sandslash you'll have to watch out for. While I talked about some weird competitive meta niches, that's not the big reason it's number one. It's Sandslash's consistency and accessibility in in-game playthroughs that puts it so high. I haven't even brought up its design yet either. It might be the all-time best design for a ground type that's supposed to be smaller in stature. Tough looking, but also pretty cute. It's a good friend for your Pokemon journey. And those are my top 10 most underrated Pokemon in Red, Blue, and Yellow. Do you agree with this list? What qualifies as underrated will definitely vary from player to player, and there are definitely a few other Pokemon that could have made it. And I'd love to see what Pokemon you guys think are underrated or overlooked in Gen 1. Let me know your thoughts down below. And with that, I'll see you next time. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching my content. With Scarlet and Violet DLC on the way, we have a lot to be excited for. Not just that though, but I've got a bunch of other cool series planned throughout the year that I'm sure you guys will love. If you want to support my other forms of content, over on Mystic Reads, I read fanfics. One of them right now is Road to be a Pokemon Master Kanto Edition, where Ash and Serena start from the very beginning and journey through Kanto together. On Mystic Umbreon Shorts, I do other exclusive Pokemon content such as Pokemon Facts, and on Saturdays, I upload my top 5 favorite Pokemon of a type. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an excellent day.